Well, it's my real honor to present the next panel. They've already congregated here. The first panelist is Mary Eberstadt. She's certainly no stranger to Napa either. She is right now Chair of Culture at the Catholic Information Center in Washington, D.C. She's also a Senior Research Fellow at the Faith and Reason Institute in Washington, D.C. She has published many books that are well known, certainly in Catholic circles. Primal Screams is her latest one, and How the West Lost God, the Adam and Eve After the Pill, and many others, including her book on Dangerous to Believe. It's really an excellent book. She certainly has published in many journals and certainly is well known on the speaking and media circuit, and obviously a real friend of the Institute. The second panelist that we have is Lenore Ealy. She is the Vice Chancellor of the Universidad San Francisco de Marroqui in Guatemala City, but in addition to that, she was the Director of Poverty and Communities at the the Charles Koch Institute for many years, and prior to that had a very interesting background in nonprofit work and doing many different things in the area of community and poverty. So she should be spectacular for this particular question that we're dealing with. The third person that we're involved here is Rob Hayes. Rob Hayes is the CEO and the owner of the Ashford Hospitality Trust, which owns 100 hotels in trust around the world. He is definitely involved in Catholic nonprofit activities. He's the board chair for the Aquinas Institute of Catholic Life at Princeton University, also on the boards, several boards at the University of Dallas, the Public Policy, Ethics and Public Policy Center in Washington, D.C., and has a real background in this area of communities as well. And finally, our moderator for this panel is Rebecca Teti. She is the operations director for the Principled Entrepreneurship program at the Busch School at Catholic University, and prior to that she was responsible for launching and relaunching many nonprofit schools, NGOs, and all kinds of things in her background. So this is really going to be, I think, a very interesting topic, communities in an age of communitarianism and division, and I think the panelists are eminently qualified to talk about this, and so I turn it over to you, Rebecca. Thank you.
Thank you, Father. Welcome, everyone. Between individualism and collectivism, there is a third way, a rich pattern of association. Just because individuals are not collectivized, it does not follow that they are not communal. So said Michael Novak in his treatment of community in the spirit of democratic capitalism. There, Novak does what he was really best at, which was hold up the academic theory to the mirror of what actually happens on the ground. And looking at the American experience, he, who considered himself at one time a democratic socialist, saw that Americans, far from being atomized individualists, were actually experts at community building and associating. And the corporation, he held, was in fact a novel form of association that built friendship and peace through cooperation and working together on common goals. But he also noticed, even in 1981, that our moral and cultural traditions have not kept pace with our economic freedoms. And he saw that democratic capitalism suffered from an underdevelopment of guidance for the spiritual life that was necessary to uphold the system. The life of the spirit is far from stifled by democratic capitalism, he wrote, but in the absence of strong moral guidance, it's often squandered. We meet today in a country that seems, at least, to be squandering its enormous built-up reserves of goodwill for one another, making the trust necessary for free economies more difficult and free association itself more fraught. Our panelists this morning, now well introduced by Father Spitzer, have been pondering this problem, each in his or her own realm. And so we're delighted that they have the opportunity to share their thoughts about the way forward for us. We're going to begin with Mary Eberstadt, who's going to talk to us a little bit about why this constant fraying, what is the root of identity politics, and what is the real human need that is at the root of that quest for identity. And so she'll kind of tell us what the problem is. And then Lenore, Ealy, and Rob Hayes, each from their own perspectives. Lenore will concentrate on the realm of philanthropy, and Rob more on the realm of business as a business owner. But each of them will have their own response about the way forward. And then we're going to do a round of Q&A amongst ourselves afterwards. So we'll begin with you, Mary.
Thank you. Thank you, Rebecca and Father. It's a privilege to be here. When the great Michael Novak died in 2017, a couplet popped itself into my mind unbidden, and it stayed there for days like a song that gets stuck and won't go away. Once upon a time, there was a lion, and the lion had a voice like a lamb. Today, that lion is badly missed. Michael was one of the greatest intellectual mentors of his generation. He was also an avuncular genius, a novelist, a Salinist, a devoted family man who nevertheless made room for strays of every stripe in the Novak home. Michael and his wife Karen were dear friends to my husband Nick and me, with ties of work and friendship connecting us through decades. And quite beyond personal bonds, there was Michael as he would become known around the world, a man combining the rarest of talents, a thinker of the first order who was also a community builder of the first order. So for our purposes here, it is that Michael that I'd like to invoke, Michael, the community builder. This brings us to the differences between the era of Michael's heyday and our own. 30-odd years ago, say, the threats to social order and human freedom were obvious to a great many people in the United States, Western Europe, the East, and otherwise. They were the threats posed by collectivist ideologies like communism that obliterated the individual. They were threats like militant atheism that suppressed the fundamental right to religious liberty. And they were the threats of coercive economic grand plans that thwarted individual genius, creativity, and entrepreneurship. Excuse me. All of that was true, and because thinkers like Michael knew that it was true, they were able to influence the course of societies and governments. In the same spirit, those of us present today are also obliged to search the signs of our times. We are enjoined to consider how we might improve on today's fallen world, a world with signature problems that are different from those that went before. And the first step down that road, as was true 30 years ago, is to analyze and speak plainly about the situation in the West today. The signature difference between now and then can be summarized in a single sentence. Today, unlike 3 decades ago, the slogan, "More freedom," does not suffice to address what most needs addressing. Today, the primary obstacles to a more humane social order are far closer to home, literally. The first such problem that has worsened since the 1990s in the United States and other Western nations is one that most leaders in our nations fear to discuss, which makes remedial action even harder. It concerns the preeminent community in society, the family, specifically the weakening of that fundamental institution across the West. Everyone knows the facts, whether they are spoken aloud or not. Families in our societies are more broken than they used to be. Fatherless homes have become commonplace. Families are also smaller than they used to be. They are more scattered. More and more young people have no sibling of the same sex or sibling of the opposite sex, or no sibling at all. And what applies to siblings is also true of uncles, aunts, cousins, and other extended family. There are fewer all the time. Fewer is the word of our generation. Meanwhile, more and more young people shy from initiating families themselves. This diminishing of the family is paralleled by another long-running trouble across the West, the diminishing of religious faith, which we are all familiar with. These trends are intricately related. I wrote a book called How the West Really Lost God to explain that sentence. Today's men and women of the West are materially better off than other generations in history. But when it comes to immaterial riches, like a large and loving family, or a loving community conferred by organized religion, many of our contemporaries are far more impoverished than those who went before. Now, this dramatic collapse of elemental human relations began over 60 years ago. It has accelerated steadily. It means that many people, including many people in authority today, have no hands-on experience of what it means to take care of a baby or a sick person or an elderly relative. In other words, many of today's citizens are influencing our governments without having been schooled in real-life obligations and sacrifices themselves. 30 years from now, I believe this unprecedented descent into solipsism and solitude will turn out to be one of the most consequential developments of our century. Why? Because human beings, like other animals, are social creatures. And as a species, we have unintentionally but really shrunk the number of people we can trust, learn from, imitate, ask for advice, etc. We are trying to build shelters for ourselves with fewer and fewer bricks at our disposal. One more result of this loss is that some people in these same societies are now losing their grip on elementary realities. Why is there confusion today in our most privileged institutions about what a woman is or what a man is? There is confusion because not enough people have had examples before them to study in the first place. There is confusion because intergenerational learning of both an earthly and supernatural kind have been radically interrupted for 60 years. Now, what are we as Catholics to do about this? I just want to throw out a couple of thoughts before turning over discussion to the more informed members of the panel. First, I think we need to understand something that has gone unsaid for too long. The view of humanity embedded in identity politics is diametrically opposed to that of the Catechism of the Catholic Church. Identity politics divides the world into oppressors and oppressed. It demands that we give up on the people who are not like us. Christianity demands exactly the opposite. And some of the best-known parables in the gospel concern exactly this open and loving approach to the world. The Good Samaritan is good for this reason, because he rescues someone from a group opposed to his own. The founding notion of identity politics, to regroup according to victim status and abandon relationships with others, is incompatible with a Christian approach to the question of anthropology. Identity politics is also inimical to Christian teaching, and especially Catholic teaching, in one other way, that I would like to emphasize this. In a world ruled by identity politics, there is no redemption. This is a big part of why politics feels so unbearable these days. Identity politics does not leave anyone a way out. Every person is either oppressed or oppressor. And for oppressors, there is no escape from this earthly damnation. And that fact, I think, the fact that identity politics denies redemption, paradoxically, is a real ground for hope. The secular world offers a crabbed and degraded view of humanity that many people know intuitively to be a caricature. This is where the church and its inimitable emphasis on community comes in. Catholics understand that God created us to be social, to be brothers and sisters to those around us. In a culture that overestimates our solitary selves, we can be unique witnesses to correctly estimating our need for one another. That includes in the dynamic community of business, to which Michael Novak devoted so much of his unique powers of analysis. And with that, let's turn to the other panelists who will have better insights into exactly that world. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. Lenore, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Mary, and thank you for the introductions. I am an outlier here. I think I've already, been outed as formerly working for the Koch Institute, and I'm a Presbyterian, a backbench Presbyterian. So I was really intrigued when I was sitting on the back bench and taking a look at the Magnificat, and I thought this is a great way to start my remarks. On page 163, which is in the readings for today, it says Saint who? Saint Philip Benizi. And it says this: sometimes the margins of society are not the edges of financial or physical prosperity, but rather lives that are radically opposed to the truth. I think Mary gave us some great insight into that, and I think that fundamental problem of lives opposed to the truth is the truth that this panel can partly take up and discuss, because the moral cultural system that this panel sets out to talk about is really that protector of truth in our culture. The last time I saw Michael Novak, who was a mentor to me on and off in my time in Washington and other places, was at the Lumber Barons Bar in Grand Rapids, Michigan, at an Acton University program. As usual, we had some whiskey and some great conversation, and so I'm here to tell you that maybe a Presbyterian can offer something into the mix in the spirit of conviviality. I think that even though our metaphysics may be different, we do believe in truths like the truths of gravity, and we believe in truths like the truths of political economy because we can observe the consequences. So I think the fundamental question, and the first panel did a nice job making the case that the moral cultural system is among the most important and foundational of the three systems, but they didn't really tell us what was wrong with it. So the big question I'll try to answer here in the next 5 or 6 minutes, and then we can hopefully open for discussion, is what's wrong with civil society? And in the spirit of good Protestant expository preaching, I'll tell you what my answer is, and then we'll try to unpack it, and maybe I'll tell you what I told you. Fundamentally, we've misunderstood this realm called civil society, and that's the term that I'm going to use. I think it's a more common term now than moral cultural system, which was Michael's elocution. But I think in general, we have various problems in civil society. We have an anemic civil society in which people are looking to government for the solutions to the problems that they see around them. And we have a malformed civil society, that the keepers of the truth in the institutions in civil society have elevated untruth. Whether you attribute this to the Gramscian long march through the institutions or not, we have problems with the earlier panel spoke about the moral hazards of redistribution. We see those problems in civil society. Our civil society leaders have focused on combining with government to try to solve the problems of poverty when we know that the economic system is the system that solves the problems of poverty. But we've taken up a job in civil society that's not its primary function and that's interfering with the solution to the problems of poverty throughout the world. Finally, we have a reactionary and nostalgic civil society. It's looking back for solutions and back for older traditional forms of life. But as Michael reminds us in this book, we're constantly moving forward. And so I think contrary somewhat to what Rusty Reno said, I feel like we need more innovation and creativity, and I think that's in the spirit of where Michael was with this. So let me back up now and talk about this system, this moral cultural system, which Novak interestingly called both the least developed and delinquent and the most ambitious and dominating system of the three systems that support democratic capitalism. By most ambitious and dominating, he was pointing to the impact of mass communications. And we have to remember that he wrote this book well before the age of web-based social media. So he's referring primarily to television and radio and the reach that they had. And I want to read what he described about the impact of radio and television, and then in your mind, think about how that magnified with the ability of web-based social media outreach. He said that mass communications had created a new nervous system, almost as it were a new collective brain, for the instantaneous transmission of ways of looking at the world. In a sense, he said, ideas and symbols have become more powerful than reality. So what are the ideas and symbols that have ascended in the 20th century and the 21st century? It's terms that Michael works to help us understand and unpack. This focus on economic equality, social justice, political correctness, lots of terms like that. The term woke has been used as kind of an encompassing term. Now we have a really ironic short term. But I would say that these terms, these untruths that we've taught to ourselves and to our descendants, have led to a neurosis of our civil society, of our communities. For essentially they undermine the very ideas and institutions that are needed for democratic capitalism to be sustained. In my formation, political formation, I guess I would say, conservatives with whom I associated often critiqued communitarians as collectivist, opposed to the institutions of private property and individual interest. But Novak suggests that there is an alternative view. He says that democratic capitalism actually creates what he calls communitarian individuals. This is a little bit of a jarring term for somebody who came up through the conservative movement of the Reagan years and later. And essentially, I think this is the fundamental foundation that we need to unpack and that we've mislaid. In our classical liberal intellectual tradition, which established the ideals of the system Novak calls democratic capitalism, the leading thinkers did not see individuals living in tension with communities, and they did not see people's identification with their communities as necessarily dangerous to the larger social order. What really matters is what the epistemic framing of those communities is, and Mary's work is so important in helping us see what those epistemic frames are. Let's think about that tradition. The great economist Adam Smith set out a theory of moral sentiments that sought to explain the formation of personal and social virtues that lubricated commercial and civic life. The great politician Edmund Burke noted that to be attached to the subdivision, to love the little platoon we belong to in society, is the first principle and the germ, as it were, of public affections. It's the first link, he said, in the series by which we proceed toward a love of our country and to a love of mankind. Later, Alexis de Tocqueville, the great student of comparative social institutions, argued that understanding America's new forms of voluntary association was the key to assessing the prospects for democracy. Novak continued and extended this tradition of social inquiry. He saw that under democratic capitalism, this sturdy triune framework, which he called it, which divided the political system from the moral and cultural system, and the economic system from both of those, served as a source of creative energy, that these three systems engaged in a dance together somehow, served as the source of creative energy that advances our civilization and as a source of countervailing checks and balances against the excesses of the crony capitalist, the tyrant, or the overly ideological cultural elite, whether the priest, the scholar, or the journalist. So what does he make of this communitarian individualist that he tells us about? He says that this individual, given freedom to pursue his self-interest, rightly understood, within the institutional framework of democratic capitalism, would better himself, better his family, and come to have sentiments of love and gratitude for the system itself as a good of order. Of course, Novak also recognized that democratic capitalism was not yet understood and loved by most people. It faced a serious opponent in the ideals of democratic socialism. And Novak thought that democratic capitalism was more likely to perish through its loss of its indispensable ideals and morals than through the weakness of its political system or its economic system. So the moral cultural system was the weakest link. In 1996, I'll turn to a little bit of the work that I've done now to maybe analyze why this weak link is there. We have to turn to history. In 1996, Philanthropy Magazine published an essay by my mentor and colleague Richard Cornell, who expressed similar concerns about the problems of civil society, or as he had earlier called it, the independent sector. He titled his talk, Denationalizing Community, and he described the nationalization of community that had taken place in the early 20th century, first as a response to the social dislocations of industrialization, urbanization, and immigration, and later in response to the economic challenges of the Great Depression. Abetted by the scientific philanthropy of the progressive era, government bureaucracies were awarded more and more responsibility for social welfare and for the manufacture of nationalist sensibilities. By the late 20th century, the vast associational power of Americans, that power that Tocqueville had remarked when he visited the United States in the 1830s, this vast power had been shifted away from solving primary problems in communities. What was left to citizens in the Great Society was mostly to vote and pay taxes. Traditional community associations and charitable organizations became part of a nonprofit industrial complex that now operationalized ideals of social justice and elevated institutions favoring bureaucratic administration and expertise more than pragmatic experimentation. Cornell believed that this ill-considered disconnection of the people from the work of their society and the care of their society, I think is the care of their society, as Mary just notes, not only deprived the society of its most valuable and abundant resource, this vast energy of people, but that it was the root cause of the loss of the feelings of cohesion and solidarity. Both Novak and Cornell then diagnosed troubling symptoms of the decline of civil society, properly understood as the sphere where we experience and give, where we receive and give beneficent care, but also the sphere in which the intellectual and moral formation of persons takes place. Looking about us today, we see everywhere signs of disformation or malformation, creating toxic politics, woke capitalism, and communities where freedom is being crowded out. Once indispensable sites of cooperative problem solving, families, voluntary associations, county school boards, college campuses, churches, and corporate boardrooms are now battlefields. Where then are we left if this innervation of civil society persists, and what might you as business and philanthropic leaders do? The answer is not easy, but it is simple, I think. Your role is to help re-energize what Hayek called the creative powers of a free civilization. For Cornell, community was something that emerges when people come together to accomplish things that are important to them and succeed. He thought the recovery of communities would begin once people who could see a problem would immediately start a creative and collaborative search for solutions. Novak delved a layer deeper to try to understand the source of our creative powers. The problem posed for political economy by the doctrine of the Trinity, he wrote, is how to build human community without damage to human individuality. Perfectibility of either men or societies is not the goal of either of these critical thinkers, but each of us is in our own sphere called to seek the betterment of the world around us. This is the meliorist versus the reconstructionist or revolutionary approach to social reform that we heard in the first panel. But this means that we must all be problem solvers, and we must move into our communities as bearers of grace and caritas. We must enter our communities without abstract preconceptions, and we must seek to understand the concrete conditions of people's lives. Subsidiarity, of course, simply means that solving practical problems should be done, as Novak tells us, at the level closest to the concrete reality. Unlike those who call today for national conservatism or common good constitutionalism, which I believe are forms of conservative identity politics, I believe it may be time to denationalize our politics, to reaffirm our fraternity, to return to humility in the light of the complexity of moral and cultural problems, and to forswear turning the weapons of state power against those who disagree with us. But this does not mean that we cannot act. In fact, we must. At the community level, we need to roll up our sleeves and begin solving problems together. We need many more experiments in new forms of schooling, new ways of supporting single mothers, better approaches to job training, more effective ways of helping people conquer addictions. We need new ways of thinking about the problems that Mary's work so clearly identifies with the brokenness of gender identity. We need more imaginative ways to ameliorate the dislocating impacts of creative destruction and to help people continuously retool for work in a post-industrial knowledge economy. And we need more gentle and conciliatory voices discussing the news of the day and inviting others to conversations instead of shouting matches. Finally, we need to study and pray together to understand the truths that will help us restore the spirit of democratic capitalism. Thank you.
Thank you, Lenore. I'll turn it over next to Rob Hayes.
Thank you, Rebecca. So my comments are going to be a little less prepared, and I am just a hotelier from Texas. So, however, when I was a student in college in the fall of 1998, I had the privilege of having a gentleman by the name of Robbie George as my thesis advisor. And I asked him when we were deciding what my thesis topic was going to be, he asked me what I was interested in. And I said, well, I'm interested in business and finance. I'm interested in political theory. I'm interested in Catholic stuff. And he started kind of rooting around in his desk, and he found this document, this encyclical called Centesimus Annus, and threw it at me across his desk and said, read this thing. This may have something in there. And then he said, if you like it, you should read this book. And he pulled a book off the shelf, and it was The Catholic Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism by Michael Novak. And that book, along with that encyclical, was the beginning of my intellectual journey into the Catholic world. And probably maybe the highlight of my entire kind of academic life, even though I'm a business person, was I was a 25-year-old graduate student in Rome studying philosophy. And I was on this program in Krakow, Poland, called the Tertium Millennium Program with George Weigel and Michael and Father Newhouse and some others. And the best, maybe the best days of my life were going to the town square in Krakow and getting the stories out of George and Michael and Father Newhouse after about 2 beers. And I probably can't repeat the stories they told, but they were, it was fascinating. And so Michael's got a very near and dear place in my heart. And so, thank you for the opportunity to be here. I do think what is interesting in thinking about kind of these 3 stools, and in particular this kind of moral cultural realm, is that I think we as Christians, and more explicitly as Catholics, have completely forgotten the power of business to form culture. And we have unfortunately gone into the last several decades, as I think Catholic social doctrine has continued to form and build, with this idea that we ought to be neutral, and our business places are places of neutrality. And in that case, we lost, and we were wrong. People would say, we can't use our businesses to form our employees or form culture. And I think what we've seen now, particularly with the rise of kind of woke Inc., is that is a religion, or at least a quasi-religion in terms of their beliefs, their assumptions, and their metaphysics. And they've been extraordinarily successful in using business as a means to spread the gospel of wokeism and identity politics. Because it's not based in reason. It's not based in the market. It's kind of a proactive program. And so I think that's the opportunity for us, is to really rethink what does it mean to be a business person in trying to form our culture, and more explicitly trying to form our employees. And an example I give is, and this is a little more on a personal basis, is that, so as you can imagine, being in the hotel business, we went through a very, very difficult time. I know Tim can relate, where we own 100 and something hotels all around the country, publicly traded company. So by the way, for the ADF people, I'll be happy to talk to you about the visibility project. And you're going to have to name and shame at some point in time, by the way, because that'll be more effective. But we went through a very, very difficult time where our revenues and our cash flow in every month went from $50 million a month to negative $50 million a month, and our revenues dropped 95%. And we had to let go or furlough 93% of the 10,000 employees around the country that we had. And so we were very, very close to going bankrupt. And as part of that, for the first time in my life, I dealt with panic attacks, deep anxiety, kind of mental health. And I've got a wonderful marriage and 6 kids, and try to live the faith. And I'd never dealt with pressure and anxiety like that. Well, I managed to kind of work my way through that. But on the heels of all that, I saw a lot of similar things in my employees and the people in my company. And so, one thing that was a real example for me of culture building was I talked to some of my employees about this. And some of you may know there's a doctor at Harvard Medical School, a guy named Dr. Kevin Majors, who has a program called Optimal Work. That's a kind of a mix of traditional virtue ethics and cognitive behavioral therapy, and he deals with people with depression and whatnot. But he's got this great program that forms people in kind of professional work and dealing with these issues. And I offered to basically pay for a lot of my employees to go through this program kind of with me. And it was something that was incredibly powerful to kind of build up this culture of people that have a variety of beliefs, a variety of backgrounds. And it was something that was, I think for the first time, something that we saw was building for the good of these associates, these people and my employees. I think the one other thing that we haven't thought about very broadly yet is we've seen the inability of our culture to learn how to dialogue and learn how to communicate in a way that seems to be healthy. We've lost this civility. Is that I can't think of another avenue where we can work to actually improve that than in the business world. I think your professional life is probably the only place that you go purposefully to hang out with people that don't agree with you on about any other issue. And because in your own schools, you probably just hang out with parents, or you go to a school where you all are fairly aligned. In your social life, you tend to hang around people that agree with you. It's really in the corporate world where you sit across the table from somebody who has a belief in absolutely nothing that you believe in. And I think, therefore, that is the place where we need to look to rebuild civility in our culture. It won't come in the political realm. It won't come in most other realms. And I think that's probably the something that we need to be thinking about is how do we rebuild civility and dialogue. Authentic dialogue is probably through business. So I think that's one of the great questions for us as Catholics is we need to be using the business world and our businesses as more proactive builders for the good and for culture than we have been, because the other side has, and they're doing it much better than we are. But we have the truth, and we have truth, goodness, and beauty, which is inherently more attractive. We just need to be effective in using it.
Thank you very much to each of our panelists. I have a follow-up question for each of you. Mary, it strikes me that I never knew anybody who was more fully Polish and more fully himself than Pope John Paul II. Not to say that I knew him so much personally. But the contrast between this Polish Pope, who we know in his background had lived under Nazi tyranny and actually was involved in an underground theater group to try to preserve Polish language, Polish culture, all the things. When the Nazis came in, one of the first things they did was try to destroy national identity of every culture. And my own family fled pogroms in Russia, and the Soviet Union did the same thing, always tried to crush any kind of national culture. So you can't sing your songs, you can't wave your flags, you can't talk about anything about your own history and your own heroes. And so I wonder whether the culture doesn't do an injustice, a fundamental injustice to people in assuming that anyone who raises a flag is a nationalist who's on the way to on the way to fascism, and that we aren't in a way preventing people from building the inherent identity that actually makes it possible to relate to someone else. So for example, my family background is Jewish, but I can watch my big fat Greek wedding and relate to it. Why? Because there's a fundamental, having a Jewish grandmother allows me to understand what it is to have a Greek grandmother or an Italian grandmother or a Southern Baptist African American grandmother, because identity is identity. And to be fully who you are actually enables, I think, at some level, the capacity to relate to others, rather than everybody trying to be a cosmopolitan and never speaking about national identity. So I wonder if you have an opinion about where the border is or what the tensions are between being nationalist in the scary proto-fascist sense and just knowing who you are so that you can relate to others.
Thank you. That's a lot. But in addition to the two kinds of unravelings that I described, family and faith, I think this question of national identity is also in the mix. If you look at opinion polls, you'll see that patriotism has been declining among younger Americans for decades now. And watching these three kinds of decline together makes me think that they are related. Each one involves a collapse of filial piety. And so what if filial piety is like a muscle, and you have to exercise it, and if it atrophies because of one kind of disuse, maybe these other kinds of disuse also contribute to its weakness, which, to put it on a more practical level, is to say, I'm just not afraid of that nationalist label. On a personal note, I worked as a speechwriter in the Reagan administration for Jeane Kirkpatrick and again for George Shultz, Secretary of State. And when you have jobs like that, you take an oath to uphold the Constitution of the United States. And similarly, there are a lot of people in my immediate family who have served in the military, and they take the same oath. We don't pledge to uphold the Charter of the United Nations or of the European Union, but the Constitution of the United States. So I think the only choice there is between nationalism and anti-nationalism, and anti-nationalism makes no sense. It's an obliteration of identity. So it makes perfect sense, as you noted, that both Pope Benedict, Pope John Paul II were nationalists because they didn't see any contradiction between love of country, love of national identity, and love of something greater, the supernatural realm, the church. I don't see a contradiction there either.
Yeah. Do we maybe need another word? So Schenker talked about how capitalism has become identified with cronyism. Maybe nationalism is also a polluted word, and we need some other way to capture what we're talking about.
Hey, can I jump in here,
Sure.
Rebecca? So do you think that, don't you think we're fundamentally tribal? I mean, humans are tribal in one way or another, in that you're going to look to identify with a group, right? And that as a result, we want those groups of which we identify to be morally good options, right? Because I think that's what you're seeing for a lot of kids that are struggling with a lot of the gender identity issues, is like they don't have their tribe, they don't have their people, they don't have institutions to lock onto, and therefore you make up your own, and social media's allowed yourself to grab onto things that may be insane, but at least you feel like you belong. And so isn't nationalism, in some sense, if done right, providing people roots that they can attach themselves to, but they're going to attach themselves to something regardless?
Yeah, of course, they will attach themselves regardless. I mean, I think we have to understand that severing the connection, especially among the young, to religious faith kind of cuts them off vertically, right, from one kind of reality, and then severing the family has cut them off horizontally. So they're just like electrons that have been thrown into space, and they're looking for any kind of connection they can find. And that's why these things that seem so prima facie insane to many of us are things that they gravitate toward, because they're going to gravitate toward something. You know, one of the problems is that the view of the United States put forth in the mostly secular media is relentlessly negative. And we don't hear the good stories. We don't have a sense of why it's so great to be American. And maybe this is another place where business could play a role, because business is relatively unfettered compared to business in other countries. And maybe that's part of the message that could be put out, not as a matter of ideological warfare, but just as an expression of gratitude for getting to operate in a country where one can be relatively free and proud to be American because of it.
Thank you. Lenore, a question for you. I was very interested because of your excellent explanation of subsidiarity and your argument in favor of maybe looking a little smaller. Have you seen, because I associate philanthropy and philanthropical problems with often big picture, top-down solutions, and here's the one solution that's going to solve everything for everyone. So I wonder what sorts of philanthropic projects you've seen give you hope, and how can we maybe persuade those who are involved in philanthropy to look smaller, not in the spiritual sense, but in the local communitarian sense that you're advocating?
Thank you, Rebecca. My sense is that the problems of crony capitalism that were discussed in the first panel extend with deep parallels to crony philanthropy, I think we could say, or to oligarchic philanthropy, that the way that our ideas about what we should do in the philanthropic world is shaped by very large top-down, let's make a plan, let's show how to solve a problem and get the government to do that over and over and over again. And I think we've seen that simply does not work. We use the term bottom up a lot these days. That's not the term I prefer. I prefer something a little more sexy, like fractal or kaleidic. Those are the words I like. So I think that essentially we have to go deep into that concrete reality of lived experience, and we have to look at the contextual problems, and we have to look at things specifically, because there are like problems, but there are different people. And so we're working in different communities and different cultures, maybe with like problems. I think one of the philanthropic experiences that I've had that's very much shaped my view and gives me hope is this work that I did after Hurricane Katrina. We went to do disaster response for children about 4 days after the storm, and set up child care centers to let the children play while their parents stood in lines. But to see the mass of spontaneous organization that could happen when top-down systems couldn't deliver ice was quite impressive. People, when they see problems like that, where there's not an easy answer or a government program that's going to go in, we do mobilize. On 9/11, long lines of people were at the hospitals waiting to give blood. So there is this spirit of beneficence, and we can do things. And I think we need to break a few of the eggs in our philanthropic sector. I think we need to reorient our nonprofit organizations. One of the things I loved about going back and revisiting this book, which I read long before I started delving into the philanthropic sector work, was that Michael observes that democratic capitalism will produce new types of organizations. And he says the business corporation is one of those things. This limited liability firm, that we limit the liability of it in order to help it take risks and demonstrate creativity and pool resources. It's a new organizational form, and I think we're missing that in the philanthropic sphere. The big foundation that evolved out of the great big trust, they evolved from big industrial fortunes, and I think we need to look at how we would do that differently. So new philanthropists don't need to just join the Council on Foundations and do what other philanthropists do. We need to think about how we would solve particular problems in particular ways with heterogeneous resources, and we can learn from the ways that others solve problems, but I think we always have to come back, to that deep, deep care, which is very concrete.
Thank you. Mary, you wanted to add something?
Yes, thank you. Because of the timing here, I don't want this opportunity to pass without mentioning what I think is a critical example of philanthropy right here and now, which is post-Dobbs, We need homes for unwed mothers. We need places where babies are safe. We need all of that. I know Catherine Jean Lopez, I think, is here from National Review Institute. She is also doing critically important work in the Archdiocese of New York on this front. So this is something for the Archdiocese, but it is also something, of course, that any private philanthropist can step in on, buy a school that isn't being used, fit it out, and know that there are going to be more babies in America, which is a great thing, and they are going to need more help, which is also a great thing. And I would like to add, I think this is an opportunity to reach across the aisle in an important way, and directly, once we have these institutions, reach out to the pro-abortion side, reach out to NARAL, reach out to the volunteers who surround Planned Parenthoods, and say, here's a volunteer opportunity to help us take care of babies. Let's join hands.
Thank you. I give the last word to Rob. Thank you for sharing your personal story, and I wonder if we ought to do more to tell the story of what businesses do inherently to create community, because we tend to think about business only in material terms, in terms of the paycheck, in terms of profits. And yet, I was just talking to some students of mine a couple of weeks ago about something that struck me was that when Jay Leno retired from The Tonight Show, in addition to the retrospective that he did, one of the things he was clearly very proud of was he brought out onto the stage 68 children that had been born to families that worked for him as part of Team Tonight Show. And so Jay Leno, who was never able to have children of his own, is very, very proud and considers his legacy as part of that business, those children and those families that were formed because he was able to give them jobs. And I wonder what you might say about whether we tell us the proper story about what business properly understood does to inherently to create community.
Sure. I mean, I think we do create culture, and we do a lot of good. So I think there's some aspect of telling the story of what we do and the good that comes from it. But I do think it has been, I guess, less focused on. I mean, I was even kind of pulling up the compendium of the social doctrine of the church. There's this point in 338. There's a whole section on the economy and on business, and one of them says, businesses should be characterized by their capacity to serve the common good of society through production and useful goods and services, right? So we make stuff for the common good. And then later on, it's kind of almost like an add-on. It says, besides this typical economic function, businesses also perform a social function, creating opportunities for meeting, cooperating, and enhancement of the abilities of the people involved. And I think the issue is that, yes, we do a lot of good stuff in forming culture. I don't think we do it purposefully enough. And I think we have to really think about what does it mean to be purposeful in that. And it is kind of deeply human and deeply relational and deeply personal, and it requires individual leaders, but then also a culture of really being able to dive into the lives of your people. And it's very hard in some sense to scale. And I think that's one of the struggles is that, whenever there's some critical mass of size of company that once you get, plus I don't know how many thousands of people, it's very hard to maintain a culture where you are deeply human and deeply personal. And so I just think it's something where, again, as Catholic business people, we need to, yes, tell the story of the good that we do, and there's a certain amount of, obviously, truth and marketing and kind of pro-business attitude we have, but I think really, honestly, there's more soul-searching that we should do on what does it mean to live that in our companies, and are we being purposeful in helping families flourish, helping women who have children, and how do they integrate with the workplace in a way to fulfill kind of the very aspects of their life that we haven't done a very good job of. And like I said, it's not an easy solution, but I think it's something that, particularly again, in light of the fact that we're seeing a loss of culture, I think we need to recognize that business is, I think, probably the best way to recover culture in the U.S.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you, Lenore. Thank you, Rob. Thank all of you.